Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture. So, today we are going to be going into the female reproductive anatomy, sexual characteristics, and hormonal control. In the last video, we talked about male reproductive system, and now we're going to be going into the female reproductive system, talking about the same topic. So, their structures and their functions, the processes and locations of meiosis, which differs from males. Now, the end product is the same, a haploid cell that has genetic variation compared to the parent cell. And then we're going to look at the difference between primary, secondary, and accessory sexual characteristics and explain the hormonal control of reproductive cycles, which includes a few more hormones than males. Now, just go an overview of the reproductive structures and functions. Not going to spend too much time here, but similar but different from males. So during development at about week 7 or week 8, all fetuses are sexually indifferent, meaning they have both male and female duct networks. So males are XY, females are XX. The fact that the Y chromosomes has a certain gene on it called the SRY gene. It's called the sex determining region on Y. At about week 7, week 8, that has causes a boost in testosterone. That testosterone leads to the male duct network being maintained and the female duct network breaking down, and then the formation of the male sex organs. The female does not get that boost, and so the male duct network is broken down and the female duct network persists. But besides the ducts and tubes themselves, the structures were relatively similar. Things just end up in different locations. Mainly, I'm referring to ovaries versus testes. Scrotum is actually the labia majora right here. So there are similarities. The clitoris is actually synonymous to the male penis. There's a prepuce on it, which is just like the foreskin right here for the clitoris. And then it actually wraps around. Most of it is hidden. And then back here, it wraps all the way around. So similar to the scrotum in a way. So that is, there are similarities and differences between the two structures. But overall here, labia majora and labia minora are the two layers of flaps around the vagina. So the vagina itself, it's kind of a misnomer. The vagina is referring to the canal itself. Um, and then here, the entire structure, which is commonly referred to as the vagina, is actually the vulva. So the vulva is the structure itself. Within the vulva, there's the vaginal opening and also the urethra opening. So they're located very close to each other, along with the anus, which isn't too far away as well, which increases the risk of UTIs in women. So then UTIs can easily travel up the short urethra and then get to the bladder right here. All right, and then if you move up through the vagina, so muscular walled tube, then we'll get to the cervix, which is the opening to the uterus. Now, the uterus is interesting because it kind of is antiverted. It turns back like this. So right back here is the sacrum, and so it's facing anteriorly rather than posteriorly, not in the same line as the vaginal canal. But then the cervix is the opening to that, and then the uterus is a muscular walled area. Which again, that's where fertilization occurs. That's where the baby develops. And then connecting to the uterus are the uterine tubes, also called fallopian tubes, which wrap up around and have these little fimbriae on them that surround the ovaries. The ovaries then release oocytes. One a month is released. They then get taken up by the fimbriae here, then travel down the fallopian tube. So moving down here a little bit, here's a little better example of that. So the ovaries are held up by the ovarian ligaments, and the entire uterus itself is held up by a broad ligament. So here, oocytes are released. They come in to the opening or the fimbriae here on the uterine duct or the fallopian tubes here. Fertilization occurs. Fertilization usually actually occurs in these tubes, and an implantation will occur eventually in the muscular wall of the uterus. So the muscles of the uterus have a few different layers as well. There's the endometrium, and the myometrium. So the endometrium has a functionalis layer that grows and falls off each month, and that's what leads to menstruation. The menstruation is the breakdown of that lining in the uterus. So that builds up during the ovarian or the uterine cycle in order, in case fertilization occurs, that's where the fertilized egg will embed and be nourished. If it doesn't happen, it breaks down, and that's what causes menstruation. Now, there are other parts here. We're not going to go into everything, but this is just showing the overall structure of. So here's the wall of the ovary. So here's the edge of a follicle. A follicle is a developing egg. So when we talk about follicular development, that is what we are referring to. But overall, that's just the general features. There are also accessory glands here as well, like these Bartholin glands, which are similar to the bulbourethral glands in male. They act as a lubricating gland. But yeah, that's the overall structure here, mainly just going over the main parts that help us understand the rest. All right, I mentioned meiosis is slightly different in females. Now, the overall, part of meiosis and, meiosis 1, meiosis 2 is the same, but males go straight through meiosis 1, meiosis 2 into producing sperm all their life. Females are born with all the eggs they have at birth. So here, when they divide, all oocytes are waiting at prophase 1 of meiosis 1. So they sit there and wait. So remember prophase 1, if we draw the cell, this is where you can see all the chromosomes, and you can see them all. They're all in there, they're condensed, and they're just sitting there waiting. And then after puberty, they then continue through meiosis 1, finish it, and go to meiosis 2, where they then become a secondary oocyte. Now, we have this term here called a polar body. Polar bodies are formed because the female oocyte is the largest mammalian cell, and it becomes so large, one, it needs to have a lot of mitochondria, so it has a lot more cytoplasmic space in it for energy production. So it takes all the nutrients from the other cells. Typically, when a cell goes through meiosis, it divides and produces 2 daughter cells. However, this one takes all the stuff from that one and becomes larger, and then this one doesn't have enough nutrients to survive, and it just degrades, and it's called a polar body. So that's what happens in females. So males make 4 viable sperm, which with each meiosis. Females end up only making 1 viable egg, because the same thing happens again down here for another polar body after the next round of meiosis. But here, meiosis 1 resumes, and then dominant follicle is selected during the hormone process. We'll talk about that coming up in here in a bit. And that secondary oocyte is then released, and it's still waiting in metaphase 2. So after meiosis 1 resumes, it doesn't finish meiosis 1. The only time you actually finish meiosis 1 is right at the initial event of fertilization. So the moment fertilization begins, this oocyte will finish meiosis 1. It just waits at metaphase 2, and then boom, fertilization occurs and done. So if fertilization never occurs, this will eventually be passed, and nothing ever happens to it. So yeah, that's an interesting thing with females, is they're born with all of them. That's also one reason why certain disorders known as non-disjunction disorders are more common in females eggs than male sperm. Non-disjunction is when we're going through meiosis, you have your chromosomes that need to be separated. Here's some chromosomes here. They need to be pulled to opposite sides. They're pulled to the sides by spindle fibers. And the idea is that some of these spindle fibers can break down with life and increase the likelihood of chromosomal disorders with the age of the female for pregnancy. So yeah, after puberty, each month a dominant follicle is selected though, and then its goal, of course, is to be fertilized. All right, so now in women, there's the primary, just like in males, there's the primary sex organs like the vagina and the ovaries. Secondary ones include breast development. I didn't talk too much about that, but females' breasts are different than males, of course. They contain ducts that produce milk production. Prolactin is a hormone that leads to milk production. So there are duct networks there that females have, along with fatty tissue for milk production. And during pregnancy, there is breast growth because of increased milk production. And then also wider hips for childbirth and pubic hair. So the similar other secondary sexual characteristics. We talked about the male ones last time, so now the female ones: breast developments and maturity, hips broaden, pubic hair grows, and also folliculogenesis begins, which is follicular development. So each month after puberty, then the follicles begin releasing and then going through the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. Also, accessory sexual characteristics, like I said, there are the glands here. They're called greater vestibular glands. Up here, the the picture labeled them as the Bartholin's glands, which the greater vestibular glands are fine to say as well. All right, now let's look at hormonal control in females, which is a little bit more intense than males. Again, this is known as the HPG axis. So the hypothalamic, pituitary, gonadal axis. We still have the same hormones. We have, so up here during the follicular phase, so this is talking about what's going on in the ovaries. So there's the ovarian cycle and the menstrual or the uterine cycle. So they go hand in hand as well. So follicular phase, you still have the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary. You have GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, that causes the release of the same two hormones we already talked about: luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Now in females, both of those travel to the ovaries. In the ovaries, one follicle stimulating hormone is choosing what's known as the dominant follicle. So a few follicles are selected each month to go through for ovulation, and one survives a slight drop in FSH towards the end and is selected as a dominant follicle. It then begins producing estradiol, which is estrogen. Estrogen then causes a negative feedback and also causes the endometrium on the uterus, so this is tying it in with the uterine cycle, to begin growing, because the production of estrogen says, okay, pregnancy could be happening soon if this egg is released and fertilized. So that's the follicular phase. The follicular phase is talking all about follicular development. So down here we can see that. So this image here is showing as estrogen level in light blue increases, you see the endometrium also growing inside. So proliferation of growing is proliferative phase of the wall, inner wall of the uterus. And here you see FSH and LH levels. As this FSH level begins to drop a little bit, you select a dominant follicle. So that follicular development and up to ovulation phase is roughly 14 days, and that's where women can vary for their cycle being about 14 for this phase, but overall around 28. After ovulation, though, it's always 14 days until the end of the cycle, and we'll talk about why that is coming up until it all sets back up, because once you form this structure called the corpus luteum, that only lasts a certain amount of time, and that's set in stone. But the follicular phase, this one can be plus or minus, and depends on a few things. Alrighty, so we talked about a little bit going on in this photo, is kind of combining ovarian and uterine cycles together. I like to talk about them at the same time. And then we get to the next step, which is ovulation. During ovulation, as estrogen levels begin to increase, so we see this increase in estrogen right here, there's a point where it hits a max point. Typically, it has a negative feedback on GnRH, FSH, and LH. But there's a brief positive feedback where this estrogen hits a certain concentration and causes a surge in LH. So you see that LH surging right here. There's also a little bit of FSH release as well, but that surge in LH, so here you see both are released, but that surge in LH targets the follicles and then leads to ovulation. So that surge in LH, what it does is kind of weakens the ovarian wall. So we just showed the ovaries up here. So the ovarian wall out here gets a little weaker and then allows the follicle to then leave as a oocyte. And then it's released. Now, when we look at that down here, we then see the estrogen begin to drop off. And then, so this is right at day 14. So day 14 is usually when ovulation takes place, plus or minus. Don't trust an app if you're using that as birth control or you're trying to get pregnant. Um, but then we start to see another hormone here called progesterone. Progesterone begins increasing. So what causes that? Well, there's a structure called the corpus luteum that remains. After ovulation, there's some cells that surrounded that oocyte remaining in the ovary. And these cells produce a hormone called progesterone. I don't have an image of them here. But they would be up here in the ovaries, one of these little cells here that release the oocyte remains as the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum produces progesterone. What progesterone does is it maintains that endometrium, the lining of the uterus, because this is when pregnancy could take place. If pregnancy takes place, you want to keep that active. So this is known as the secretory phase. So that corpus luteum will only produce um, progesterone for a certain amount of days. And then as you see here, the endometrium begins to drop off, which begins the cycle for menstruation then. That's where that endometrium breaks down when that corpus luteum breaks down and becomes a scar tissue in the ovaries called a corpus albicans. So now if pregnancy happens, there's a signal that's sent from the zygote that goes back to the corpus luteum and says, hey, fertilization happened, keep producing progesterone, and then it keeps that endometrium maintained and progesterone levels stay high until the placenta takes over and starts producing progesterone and also something called human chorionic gonadotropin, which that's what you test for if you take a pregnancy test. But here, so the declining progesterone and declining estrogen levels are then what lead to menstruation and a restart of the phase. So this is just showing how a dominant follicle is selected each cycle. And then this one here is showing the luteal phase, which is post ovulation when progesterone is being made. So birth control usually mimics progesterone. If progesterone levels are detected by the body, your body thinks one, you're either pregnant or you're waiting to become pregnant. So here, progesterone then inhibits FSH and GnRH release as well and helps maintain the endometrium. And then every month, this goes over and over and over again. So, like I said, a little bit more complex than males, but in the end, females the difference is one, they're born with all oocytes they have in their life. A couple other hormones like progesterone, human chorionic gonadotropin as well. Um, and it's just two different cycles involved in this HPG axis. Females also stop producing estrogen later in life. So, menopause stops the estrogen production, and that leads to certain issues like increased risk factor of osteoporosis and high cholesterol levels and things like that. Males can produce testosterone throughout their whole life and keep producing sperm throughout their whole life. Alrighty, I know that was a little longer video here, but there was a lot to go over in this. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and let me know. But that was the female reproductive system. All right, I'll see you in the next one where we talk a little bit about genetics and embryo development. All right, have a great day. Bye bye.